Very recently, the channel marked its 2-year anniversary. I've been overwhelmed by all the support I've received in that time, and I truly can't thank you all enough. These Q&A videos are some of my very favourites to make, as I get to engage directly with all of your ideas. So thanks so much once again to all of you who submitted questions. This is part 4, and again I'm going to respond to 5 of my favourites here. I hope you enjoy it. My first memorable encounter with queer literature was probably Yukio Mishima's Confessions of a Mask. I'm certain that what drew me to his work initially was the intensity and drama of the mythology that surrounded his work and character. He's certainly a writer whose cultivated image and deeds have fed his reputation in the public consciousness. And this first encounter with him drove a growing obsession that would continue throughout my late teens and early 20s. In Confessions of a Mask, I was particularly fascinated by the degree of clinical introspection apparent in the prose, and by the extraordinary realization of the chasm between the wild, self-destructive currents of Ko-chan, the protagonist's inner life, and the glassy, impassive, almost inert version of his personality that he presents to the outside world. It's a depiction that concentrates with painful precision a condition of essential difference, a difference of sensibility, sensitivity, and sexual desire, which, when compared in the young narrator's mind with observable social norms, translates to a feeling of moral corruption or deviancy, with all its attendant self-loathing. I have a very vivid memory of reading a particular section of the book. I must have been around 19 at the time, still young enough to feel close to that burgeoning pubescent sexuality that ruptures into full flower before one has any clue what to do with it, and also to the memory of that bruised longing of unrequited playground love. I even recall the song that was playing as I read this passage, that poignant masterpiece, Hope There's Someone, from Anią and the Johnsons' first record, I Am a Bird Now. In my mind, these emotions and this music are tied inextricably to the character of Omi, the athletic, precociously masculine boy who becomes the focus of Ko-chan's erotic high school fantasies, and particularly to the beautiful scene that takes place on a snowy morning before the beginning of school. It's a scene of tentative pursuit and retreat, with Ko-chan following a trail of footsteps, gradually stumbling upon the letters of Omi's name written in the snow, and an ambiguous exchange between the boys, halfway between aggression and flirtation, when a conversation about the gloves the schoolboys must wear on ceremonial days leads to the first burning, earth-shaking instance of physical contact. Omi's gloved hands, whose elegance has caught Ko-chan's eyes previously, now come within touching distance. Abruptly, he thrust his snow-drenched leather gloves against my cheeks. I dodged. A raw, carnal feeling blazed up within me, branding my cheeks. I felt myself staring at him with crystal-clear eyes. From that time on, I was in love with Omi. Ko-chan's growing obsession with Omi will reach its climax in a seaside scene of self-pleasure, in which the collage of his sexual preoccupations, the abundant beauty of Saint Sebastian, the emergence of his own underarm hair, the first sprouts of black thickets reminding him of Omi's body, the fiery sun, and the restless green swells that disturb the sea's surface in hypnotic motion. All these things coalesce and culminate in a euphoric detonation of pleasure, immediately accompanied by a crushing sense of shame that can only be cleansed by surrendering to the waves. My body was shaken with a strange grief. I was on fire with a loneliness as fiery as the sun. I knelt down in the water and surrendered myself to a wave that broke at this moment and came rushing toward me with a violent roar. It struck me in the chest, almost burying me in its crushing white cap. When the wave receded, my corruption had been washed away. Together with that receding wave, together with the countless living organisms it contained, microbes, seeds of marine plants, fish eggs, my myriad spermatozoa had been engulfed in the foaming sea and carried away. One of the most incredible pieces of life writing I've read, and this is something I encountered very recently, is David Wojnarowicz's Close to the Knives, a memoir of disintegration. It collects a series of magisterial, reflective, autobiographical pieces and essays. It's woven from fragments of memory, dreams, heightened experiences of childhood, from his periods on the streets selling his body, sun-flared recollections of his most important relationships with friends and other artists. And at times, the book feels bound together by a visceral rage against an establishment that demonizes homosexuals and fails to respond to the AIDS crisis. In describing this rage, he says, "My rage is really about the fact that when I was told that I'd contracted this virus, it didn't take me long to realize that I'd contracted a diseased society as well." More than once, he will refer to the government's inaction as murderous. Indeed, one of the essays in here is a kind of catalogue of and diatribe against the most homophobic American politicians. But as important and bold as this rage is, what comes across most forcefully to the reader is the vividness of Wojnarowicz's experience of the world and the degree to which this is captured in his mesmeric prose. Whatever he describes, it is suffused with an intensity of vision, and as he gets closer to the end of his life, his writing glows, becomes incandescent, like the light of late summer.
These days, I see the edge of mortality. The edge of death and dying is around everything, like a warm halo of light, sometimes dim, sometimes irradiated. I see myself seeing death. It's like a transparent celluloid image of myself is accompanying me everywhere I go. I see my friends, and I see myself, and I see breath coming from my lips, and the plants are drinking it, and I see breath coming from my chest, and everything is fading, becoming a shadow that may disappear as the sun goes down.
Wojnarowicz died at the young age of 37, but that intensity of experience was never lost. His tape journals, recorded in the late 1980s, are a very moving and sometimes painful reminder of this.
When I think about talking into this machine, as usual, I get incredibly self-conscious, but beyond that, it's like all I can think to talk about is my anxieties, but maybe by talking about my anxieties, I can break through to something else. And then if I don't break through to something else, it doesn't really matter. At least that's the mood I'm in. All this emptiness, all this desolation sometimes feels like one big great mirror held up to my own heart, my own mind, my own soul, if you will. But I just feel very desolate, very sad, very anxious, a little bit scared. And the thing that I keep thinking about is my own death, of not wanting to die, this incredible fear of dying. If I really think about it, like if I think of sentences like, oh, are you going to David's funeral, or are you going to Wojnarowicz's funeral, I just think, I freeze. If I think of myself lying inside some plain box or whatever foreign burial I'll one day have, it just makes me freeze. But right now I'm riding through all this beautiful landscape. It's just scrub, brush, landscape, plains, and these brown, dark mountains in the distance covered with smog or smoke from the fireplaces this time of year. And big explosions of trees just suddenly uttering out of the earth, uttering out of crevices in the earth, and it's really wonderful. It's a feeling of winter, and yet the sun's so warm.
I was also impressed by Thomas More's achingly spare novel of 2021, Forever. It's written in brief, concentrated chapters that, in spite of their clean, almost unadorned prose, manage to carry a huge emotional weight. The reader inhabits the consciousness of a young man in Paris, escaping everything, spiraling downward and letting loose the rudder of his own life. Much of its power comes from its texture, tone and mood. It's shot through with bleak self-criticism, but also with a great fragility and vulnerability. The narrator navigates a string of hookups, and as much as the alienation and emptiness of casual sex often comes brutally to the fore, there are also moments of tenderness and intimacy in which the arms of a stranger can bring a comfort that nothing more familiar ever could. There's also a compelling exploration of the heightened sensitivity that can emerge under such conditions. Cruising taught me how to understand people more than years of therapy could. It taught me to read people. It teaches me something new every time. Instincts reveal themselves more precisely than usual. They rise to the surface, multiple senses that are otherwise dormant. The body has a calm intention that drives it like in dreams. The body can speak without words. I'm briefly, beautifully free of language. Incidentally, I really enjoyed listening to the interview with Thomas More on Wake Island podcast, in which he and the host Paul Kay discussed this very subject in great detail. And in general, I strongly recommend listening to Wake Island. It has a wealth of fantastic interviews with some really interesting contemporary writers such as B.R. Yeager, Brian Evanson and Megan Lamb. Just to mention one more book very briefly, I recently enjoyed Golnoush Noor's The Ministry of Guidance, the short story collection from 2020. She's an Iranian author writing in English, and this book explores with tremendous sensitivity the impact that an oppressive society has on the lives of gay men and women, the rifts that crack the foundations of familial relationships, the denial of one's own identity, the fear of religious transgression, and the desire to escape pitted against the gravitational pull of home. I must admit to not having gone out of my way especially to explore queer literature as its own category. So if there are things that you think I should check out, leave me a suggestion in the comments and I'll gladly try and explore it. So I have a slightly complicated relationship with John Banville. I've mentioned his having been a particular favourite of mine in my younger years, and while there are still things that I admire very much about his writing, there are other aspects about which I've grown slightly less enthusiastic over time. What appealed to me initially, I suppose, was an ambition that marked Banville out for me as a writer more closely tied to a continental European literary tradition. He was sometimes called an heir to Beckett. He set much of his work in Europe, cited French and German writers as influences. The names that floated around his work, Kafka, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, Heinrich von Kleist, felt so distant from what I could observe in the Anglophone literary culture of the time, and I was drawn to his work because of it. His characters are often outsiders, cantankerous, lonely intellectuals who scorn society in eloquent prose. And there's often a brutal humour coupled with a high seriousness in the work. I found myself most enamoured with the more surreally exuberant edges of his work, in particular the novels Mephisto from 1986 and Ghosts from 1993, both of which are oblique recastings of earlier literary material, the Faust legend and Shakespeare's The Tempest, respectively, though neither book is restrained by this indebtedness. And this was something I adored about his work, and is very much Banville's way. The Book of Evidence, for instance, owes a huge debt to Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, but is emphatically its own tale. So much of the early work, in fact, impressed me, and all of it displays the meticulous precision of his writing, his ear for the melody and cadence of what he regards as the greatest invention of civilization, the sentence.
Humankind's most momentous invention is the sentence. There have been great civilizations that did not have the concept of the wheel, but they had to have the sentence, for without it, they would have been neither great nor civilized. It is with the sentence that we think, speculate, calculate, imagine. It is with the sentence that we declare love, declare war, declare oaths. It is with the sentence that we declare the self.
This devotion to language shares quite a lot with my own sensibilities, and I could even find it quite a seductive way of viewing things. But even in Banville's formulation here, there is an emphasis on the civilized, the worthy attainments of mankind, a slight fixation on greatness and achievement that I find myself turning away from. It was around the publication of The Infinities in 2009 that I began to grow a little bit tired of what I'd come to regard as a constant rehearsal of the same search for meaning novel, a constant fetishization of the great man and of the intellect. After so many iterations, it seemed to me a kind of posturing for which I developed something of a distaste. It's been quite a few years since I read him, and it may be that I go back and find him utterly changed from what I remember, but I feel I should acknowledge that I have, in years gone by, owed many hours of pleasure to his work. So, languages are not really a simple matter for me. Like most people who received their education in England, I emerged from that education just as monoglot as the day I entered it, perhaps even more so, despite the obligatory 5 years of studying a foreign language, in my case French. More than that, even in my adulthood, I truly believed that if I hadn't learned a second language as a child, studying a new one would be entirely useless, that it was simply too late. I toyed with the idea for a long time of learning German. I'd been utterly seduced by the song cycles Winterreise and Schwannengesang. But it wasn't until my second year of university, when I was around 21, that I began to think of it as something I could possibly do. I went about this in quite a strange way, I suppose. To this day, I find language learning manuals and the general process of language learning, once the initial buzz has worn off, quite dull. I had little interest in speaking German. I was far more interested in getting straight to German literature. So that's what I did. I would describe my limited knowledge of German as having been acquired by brute force. I took no lessons, but simply went to the dusty bays of German books in my university library, borrowed what I could and read alone, armed only with a dictionary and a grammar, looking up word after word until something resembling sense began to take shape. It is completely mad and ill-advised, but it's really what I did for many years. And while I don't recommend it at all as a method, it did lead to a relative comfort in reading the language after a certain point. I'll never forget the feeling of elation I had at making it through my first novel in German. A novel by Cees Notenboom, as it happens, translated from the Dutch. I'd go on to read many more throughout my 20s and developed a particularly strong relationship with Homo Faber, ein Bericht by Max Frisch, which is the novel I've read most often in German, and which I adore all the more for the time and attention I lavished upon it while struggling through it several times in a foreign language. As a result of my ridiculous methods, I only ever acquired a passive knowledge of the language, and I'd never claimed to speak it. Sadly, it's been quite a few years now since I picked up a book in German, and I've let it go somewhat, which feels like something of a waste. Instead, I've focused more energy on the language of the country in which I live. Na pewno będę tego żałować, ale myślałem, że fajnie byłoby mówić troszeczkę po polsku, żeby pokazać wam, na jakim poziomie jest mój polski w tej chwili. Mieszkam w Polsce od dawna teraz i szczerze mówiąc, jest mi wstyd, że nie mówię lepiej po polsku, ale nadal walczę z tym językiem codziennie. Jeszcze mam szereg problemów z mówieniem. Największym problemem jest to, że każda rozmowa jest mocno spowolniona, jak ja staram się coś powiedzieć. To jest po prostu koszmar, naprawdę. A z czytaniem nie wygląda dużo inaczej. Jeśli chodzi o książki i czytanie, szczerze mówiąc, rzadko czytam po polsku teraz. Czytam bardzo wolno i to jest bardzo wymagające dla mnie. Kiedy miałem więcej czasu w życiu, często czytałem i sprawdziłem nowe słowa w słowniku, pisałem je w marginesach. Na przykład czytałem powieść Marka Chłaska pod tytułem Drugie zabicie psa. Czytałem kilka opowiadań horrorowych Łukasza Orbitowskiego z wigilijnych psów. Nawet tłumaczyłem część Autostrady, jedno z jego opowiadania, które mnie zachwycił, ale niestety nie skończyłem tego. Czytałem też poezję Miłosza i Szymborskiej z moimi nauczycielkami, ale z tych wielkich, klasycznych książek z polskiej literatury niestety ani jednej nie czytałem po polsku. Ale mam nadzieję, że dam radę w przyszłości. Chciałem powiedzieć też, że moja świetna nauczycielka Ania ma swój własny kanał na YouTubie i jej filmiki są naprawdę świetne, więc zachęcam was do oglądania, jeżeli chcecie nauczyć się polskiego. I mam nadzieję, Ania, że nie popełniłem za dużo błędów w tym filmiku. Daj mi znać, jak było. Finding a good publisher, and particularly an independent press that curates its catalogue with aesthetic intuition, is something like finding that friend who acts as your guide through culture and helps you develop your taste. I remember Clive James once describing such friends as people who show you where to put the needle down, and a good publisher can do just that. As there are so many that I'd like to mention, I'll try to go through my choices relatively quickly. But first I have to mention Snuggly Books, which over the past decade has significantly expanded the access to European decadent literature available in English translation, as well as decadent works written in English originally. Despite only having been around since 2013, their catalogue is already extremely impressive. To offer a few examples, they reprinted Eric Stenbock's, at the time very hard to come by, Studies of Death, as well as his 3 collections of verse. They've also published a number of really valuable anthologies, including The World in Violet, an anthology of English decadent poetry, Snuggly Tales of Hashish and Opium, and Decadence and Symbolism, a showcase anthology, just to name a few. It makes sense, of course, that Snuggly Books is one of a group of presses associated with the neo-decadence movement, and they also publish some truly exciting and very unique contemporary fiction, including work by some of my favourite authors, such as Quinton S. Crisp, Brendan Connell and Justin Isis, all of whom I've mentioned in previous videos. The excellent but now sadly defunct Chormu Press makes a kind of pairing with the contemporary wing of Snuggly Books, and it was responsible for introducing me to many of these authors in the first place, which automatically secures it a seat in my personal pantheon of small presses. Dorky Archives' devotion to experimental writing for nearly 40 years now is also deeply impressive. I particularly love their hardback editions of Arnold Schmidt. I'm still looking out for a matching version of Nobodaddy's Children. I've mentioned them before, but I'm fascinated by what Apocalypse Party has been putting out recently, as its shadow expands, darkening the edgelands of contemporary American fiction. I'm a huge fan of these older, colder editions of Samuel Beckett's works. I believe that Calder Books is no longer running, but that some of their catalogue has been taken on by Alma Classics. It still seems worthy of exploration. Amphetamine Sulfate also strikes me as a very exciting press, whose output I'll certainly be continuing to follow. Their loving attention to the books as objects is exquisite too. I also really love the classic series from Broadview Press. They provide excellent scholarly editions of very well-known classics of world literature. They have editions of Herman Melville, Jane Austen, Oscar Wilde, etc. But even a quick glance through their listings will reveal that their catalogue is much wider and deeper than one comes to expect from such a series. One finds many fascinating works from the last 2 or 3 centuries that seem to have been utterly left behind by the more prominent classic series. Of the bigger, more monumental publishers, I have to mention Library of America, whose beautiful hardback editions of the complete works of many of the most important American writers are just wonderful. And I very much admire their efforts to expand the canon to include writers like Octavia Butler, Lafcadio O'Hearn, Philip K. Dick and Ambrose Bierce, whose work might otherwise be locked outside the city walls and peremptorily dismissed as genre fiction, as though literary fiction were itself anything other than simply another genre. I often find myself lamenting the fact that there's no equivalent publishing effort in my own country. If you're looking for good quality hardback editions of the complete works of any author other than Charles Dickens, you can pretty much forget about it. Such things seem only to be available in prohibitively expensive scholarly editions from university presses. I dream one day of seeing a publishing effort in Britain that would attempt to achieve a fraction of what Library of America has. So this question really caused me to reflect on my reading habits. It even prompted me to look back at the last 7 years of my reading recorded on Goodreads. And I was quite shocked to find that I couldn't see a single book there that I would describe as wholesome or nice in any way. What I saw instead was a kind of catalogue of despair, of conflict, grief, brutality, horror and gloom. I'll readily admit to myself that my reading taste bends rather resolutely into the shadows. And yet, despite the fact that my reasons for turning to literature are not ordinarily to find comfort or to feel better about my life and the world, I still think that many of the books I read contain certain moments of innocence and ecstasy that, when treated with care, can easily be as aesthetically satisfying to me as any literary exploration of that darker end of the spectrum that I tend to favour. One might even argue that such ecstatic moments burn all the more brightly when framed against a cavernous dark. Take, for example, a book I mentioned earlier, Homo Faber by Max Frisch, which many would consider to be a deeply unsettling book given the perversion of its central love affair. The book can be thought of as a kind of inverted Oedipal narrative, concerning as it does the story of a man whom chance contrives to fall in love unwittingly with his own daughter. But for all its darkness, there are moments of great tenderness between these two ill-fated characters that I find very touching. The unemotional engineer, Walter Faber, is drawn by his arty daughter, Zabet, into a competition of simile-making as they travel through Italy and Greece. Though the game begins as a jibe against Walter's ostensible lack of imagination and sentimentality, it grows in tandem with his ability to feel at a greater emotional depth than he ever has before. And the act of comparison, of image-making and the transmutation that occurs between object and language, by slow degrees becomes the true key to an expanded palette of emotion.
Vor Sonnenaufgang ist es ja am kältesten. Dann rauchen wir zusammen noch unsere letzte Zigarette. Vom kommenden Tag, der für Sabet die Heimkehr bedeuten sollte, haben wir kein Wort gesprochen. Gegen 5 Uhr das erste Dämmerlicht, wie Porzellan. Von Minute zu Minute wird es heller, das Meer und der Himmel, nicht die Erde. Man sieht, wo Athen liegen muss, die schwarzen Inseln in hellen Buchten. Es scheiden sich Wasser und Land, ein paar kleine Morgenwolken darüber. Wie Quasten mit rosa Puder, findet Sabet. Ich finde nichts und verliere wieder einen Punkt. 19:9 für Sabet. Die Luft um diese Stunde wie Herbstzeitlosen. Ich finde wie Zellophan mit nichts dahinter. Dann erkennt man bereits die Brandung an den Küsten, wie Bierschaum. Sabet findet wie eine Rüsche. Ich nehme meinen Bierschaum zurück. Ich finde wie Glaswolle, aber Sabet weiß nicht, was Glaswolle ist. Und dann die ersten Strahlen aus dem Meer. Wie eine Garbe, wie Speere, wie Sprünge in einem Glas, wie eine Monstranz, wie Fotos von Elektronenbeschießungen. Für jede Runde zählt aber nur ein einziger Punkt. Es erübrigt sich, ein halbes Dutzend von Vergleichen anzumelden. Kurz darauf ist die Sonne schon aufgegangen, blendend. Wie der erste Anstich in einem Hochofen, finde ich, während Sabet schweigt und ihrerseits einen Punkt verliert. Ich werde nie vergessen, wie sie auf diesem Felsen sitzt, ihre Augen geschlossen, wie sie schweigt und sich von der Sonne bescheinen lässt. Sie sei glücklich, sagt sie. Und ich werde nie vergessen, das Meer, das zusehends dunkler wird, das Meer von Korinth und das andere, das Attische Meer. Die rote Farbe der Äcker, die Oliven, grünspanig, ihre langen Morgenschatten auf der roten Erde. Die erste Wärme. Und Sabet, die mich umarmt, als habe ich ihr alles geschenkt. Das Meer und die Sonne und alles. Und ich werde nie vergessen, wie Sabet singt.
Passages like this one, so charged with light and rich emotion, especially when pressed so tightly against imminent tragedy, caused me to surrender utterly and sink into my own ecstatic reverie. To answer the question, ultimately, I suppose that I'm rarely seeking comfort or wholesomeness when I turn to literature. Instead, I'm usually seeking something like an unfettered intensity, and whatever the particular emotional colouring a given book might have, it's that concentration of feeling, positive or negative, and its transmutation through literary language that I look for and that I love. Let me know in the comments if you recommend something on the warmer, more wholesome end of the spectrum. I'd love to see what you suggest. Again, if I didn't answer your question in this video, I'm sorry. There were so many I wanted to respond to, but didn't have the time for all of them. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really means a lot to me. And if you could share it online somewhere or with a friend who's into books, that would really help me out. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.